The heat in the small room felt like it was settling into her bones as Lieutenant Claire Morgan sat bound to a metal chair, her wrists pulled tight by zip ties that had already cut into her skin. Sweat rolled down her temple and stung the bruises along her cheek, while the men of Desert Viper circled her with AK variant rifles resting against their shoulders and magazines taped for quick reloads. Victor Kane moved with the slow confidence of someone who believed he owned the moment, pacing just close enough to let her feel his shadow on her face. He spoke to her as if she were nothing more than an American nurse who had wandered too far from safety. His words dripping with the kind of mockery meant to break the weak. Claire kept her breathing steady, pulling air in through her nose and letting it out in a slow rhythm that helped her measure the room. She noted the cracked window behind Kane, the single door to her left, and the 6 men inside with her, each one shifting his weight in small, impatient circles. She watched how they held their rifles, how their fingers rested near the triggers, how their magazines were seated with dirt around the edges that hinted at poor maintenance. Every detail mattered, and every detail told her who was nervous and who might move first. Kane leaned closer, his voice rising as he tried to provoke fear. But Claire stayed still and let her hair fall across part of her face. A trained SEAL learned to read chaos long before it arrived, and she felt it building now like a quiet vibration under the floor. Her mind stayed clear. Even as Kane tapped a finger under her chin to force her to look up, she lifted her head, eyes steady, her voice low and calm as she told him who she really was. The room did not move at first, but the shift in the air was immediate, the kind of stillness that comes when danger finally shows its real shape. The briefing room inside Naval Special Warfare Command felt colder than the rest of the building as Lieutenant Claire Morgan stood at attention before Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale and Captain Melissa Rain. The walls carried the faint hum of equipment, and the long table between them held neatly arranged files and a single closed laptop. Hale studied her with the steady gaze of someone who had seen many operators come and go, then noted that she had become the first woman to complete BUDS, not because she was the loudest, but because she moved with a discipline that spoke for itself. Claire kept her shoulders square and her eyes forward, letting the weight of the moment settle without showing strain. Captain Rain stepped in with a folder tucked under her arm as she outlined the emerging threat tied to a group called Desert Viper. Her voice stayed crisp while she explained how TX-13 had been routed through civilian paths near the Arizona border, hidden behind humanitarian shipments that few people bothered to check. She described the pattern of movement, the urgency of the timeline, and the gaps in intelligence that required a covert operator who could disappear in plain sight. Claire listened without shifting, absorbing each detail and waiting for the moment when she would be handed the full burden of the assignment. Rain laid out Claire's new identity as Dr. Claire Weston, a medical volunteer assigned to a border town that rarely saw federal oversight. The cover story required her to distribute supplies, track unusual traffic, and avoid confrontation unless the situation turned critical. She also learned that her only ground contact would be Sergeant First Class Thomas Reyes, a former Army Ranger who still walked with a slight limp from old shrapnel but carried a reputation for level thinking under pressure. Claire acknowledged each instruction with short responses, keeping her tone respectful and direct. Rear Admiral Hale closed the briefing by reminding her that extraction would depend on evolving conditions, not on a fixed timeline. The responsibility in his voice lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Claire felt that weight settle across her shoulders, but her stance never shifted, and her breathing stayed even. She had stepped into difficult missions before, and she understood that the silence before departure was often the hardest part, a place where resolve either held firm or cracked. The C-130 moved through the sky with a steady vibration that settled into Claire Morgan's ribs as she sat beneath the dim cargo lights. She carried only a single duffel packed with medical supplies and the documents that named her as Dr. Claire Weston, a quiet volunteer bound for a border town most people had never heard of. She kept her posture relaxed to match her cover, though her eyes traced every movement of the crew and every shift in the aircraft as if she were still on a covert insertion. By the time the plane touched down near San Miguel, she had already stepped fully into the role she needed to play. The town looked sun-baked and slow from a distance, but there was a tight pull in the air that told her something underneath the surface had already gone wrong. Claire moved through the streets with a backpack full of basic medicine, greeting residents with a soft voice that fit her identity as a doctor. She checked pulses, listened to lungs, and wrapped small wounds while keeping her attention on the rhythm of the town, the direction of passing trucks, and the way conversations hushed when someone unfamiliar walked by. Each detail became part of a picture she was piecing together without letting anyone know she was watching. Sergeant First Class Thomas Reyes met her outside a small clinic with a careful nod that hid his own tension. His limp from old shrapnel was subtle but visible, and his eyes kept drifting toward the road as two unfamiliar pickup trucks rolled past slower than necessary. He mentioned that the town had changed in the last few weeks, and that people had started avoiding eye contact when armed men appeared near the market. Claire responded with a calm that steadied him, then returned to her work with the same steady hands that made several residents whisper that she did not move like most doctors they had known. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, she felt the shadows stretch a little longer than they should. Someone was watching her, and whoever it was had grown quiet enough to stay just beyond the corner of her vision. Victor Kane arrived in San Miguel late in the morning, and the atmosphere tightened the moment his boots touched the dirt near the clinic tent. Claire Morgan felt it before she saw him. The way conversations thinned out, and how people shifted to the edges of the street, as if making room for trouble to pass. He approached her with a warm smile that never reached his eyes, and asked about her work in a tone that pretended kindness while carrying a sharp, predatory edge. His security man, Nikolai Voss, stood a step behind him with the posture of someone who knew violence well, tracking every small movement she made. Claire answered each question with the calm precision she had practiced, relying on the exact medical history she had memorized for the real Dr. Weston. She kept her breathing steady, letting it anchor her when Kane pressed deeper with questions that no passing doctor would normally receive. Her eyes stayed soft, and her hands moved at the pace of someone focused only on the child she was bandaging. But her mind stayed alert to the shifting of Kane's weight, and the look in Voss's eyes that hinted he sensed something off. She did not allow her pulse to betray her even when she felt the man's scrutiny sharpen. That evening, Reyes met her inside the dim kitchen of their rented house, with worry written across his face. He told her that 2 trucks had circled the block 3 times since sundown, and that people in town had gone silent in a way that felt practiced rather than fearful. He pointed out how Desert Viper patrols had started drifting through the market with their rifles slung low like they owned the place, behavior that had not existed a week earlier. Claire nodded while keeping her thoughts measured, knowing these were signs of a town closing in around them. Outside, the night carried a stillness that was not natural for a border community. Claire sensed the eyes following her when she checked the latch on the back door, studying the dark corners where a watcher might stand. She felt the line between her cover and her true role grow thinner as each hour passed, and the quiet hum lingering behind every footstep told her that the danger she had come to find had already started moving toward her. The local nurse arrived at their door just after sunset with her hands shaking so hard she could barely keep them still. She told Claire Morgan that her husband had been ordered to drive trucks marked with hazard symbols and that the liquid inside the barrels burned through his gloves in seconds. Claire listened without interrupting, her mind already moving toward the only conclusion that made sense. When the nurse left, Reyes met Claire's eyes, and neither of them needed to speak to know they would be heading into the desert that night. They followed the convoy from several hundred yards back, keeping their lights off and using the dips in the terrain to stay out of sight. Claire watched the trucks through compact binoculars that gave her a narrow but steady view of their route as they turned off the main road and rolled toward an abandoned ranch. The place looked dead from a distance, yet the fresh tire tracks and faint hum of machinery told a different story. Vents poked out of the ground like metal reeds, and reinforced doors covered the front of a barn that had no business needing that much protection. Reyes parked behind a low ridge, and Claire moved forward on her stomach, recording the scene with a pen camera that blinked once before capturing each frame. She filmed the trucks dropping down a concealed ramp, guards stationed at two corners, and the faint glow of lights under the barn floor. The whole site looked like a shell hiding something far more dangerous than smuggled goods. She whispered her observations into the small mic clipped to her collar, noting guard placement and vehicle count, with the calm tone of someone trained for this exact moment. Everything shifted when a sweep of white headlights cut across the desert and landed on the ridge where they hid. Engines roared as vehicles split into a search pattern that was too fast and too organized to outrun on open ground. Claire signaled Reyes to fall back and sprinted toward the brush, keeping low while the sound of boots slammed into the dirt behind her. She was only a few steps from cover when something heavy struck the back of her head, and the world dropped into a deep black that swallowed every thought. Claire Morgan woke to the sound of a ceiling fan clicking in a tired rhythm, each turn masking the low voices of the guards around her. Her head throbbed, but her awareness came back fast as she felt the zip ties bite into her wrists and realized she was still in the same sweltering room where she had first faced Victor Kane. 6 men stood inside with her, each armed with an AK variant held in a relaxed grip that suggested they expected no trouble from the woman tied to a chair. She kept her head low for another breath, letting her eyes move without drawing attention as she marked the window behind Kane, the single door to her left, and the angle each man would need to raise his rifle. When one guard stepped closer and tapped her shoulder with his boot, she shifted her wrists in a slow, controlled motion that built tension along the plastic band. She felt the flex begin to give, then snapped her hands apart with a sharp pull that cracked through the room before anyone understood what had happened. She surged to her feet and drove her shoulder into the nearest guard, redirecting his rifle with both hands as she stripped it from his grip in one clean movement. The man stumbled back, reaching for balance, but Claire had already brought the weapon to her shoulder. She fired controlled pairs, each set of shots aimed with precision that came from years of close quarters training. The tight space worked in her favor, limiting how quickly the guards could swing their rifles without hitting one another. She moved along the edge of the room, using fallen bodies as brief cover points, and never wasting a step. One guard rushed her with a knife, but she pivoted and struck him across the jaw with the rifle stock before he reached her, dropping him to the floor. When the last man fell silent, Victor Kane stood alone near the far wall with his hands trembling. Claire kept the rifle steady as she closed the distance and ended the threat with a single round placed exactly where it needed to land. She knelt beside him long enough to take his sat phone and the flash drives he carried, each one marked with numbers she already recognized as coordinate logs. The room smelled of dust and heat as she stepped over the debris, her pulse steady now that the fear had turned into something clear and controlled. Claire moved across the desert with the smell of smoke trailing her like a shadow, as the compound behind her burned in steady waves of heat. She kept her body low, holding her rifle tight against her chest while she scanned the darkness for any sign of a remaining patrol. The ground felt uneven under her boots, but the night protected her as long as she stayed within the pockets of shadow between the rocks. Far ahead, she heard the deep thrum of rotor blades, a sound that carried both hope and caution. As she closed the distance, the wind shifted and brought the faint chop of MH-60M aircraft from the 160th SOAR. Claire paused just long enough to check her magazine and ensure the weapon had not taken dust during her sprint from the compound. She moved toward the landing zone with careful steps, ready to drop behind cover if headlights flared or voices rose from the dark. When the helicopters descended, the rotor wash rolled across the sand and hit her like a sudden wall of air. A JSOC team poured out of the lead aircraft, weapons held at the low ready, as they advanced in a tight formation. Lieutenant Colonel James Porter stepped forward first, raising a hand when he recognized the battered figure standing alone in the wash of light. Claire lowered her rifle and handed him the flash drives and sat phone she had taken from Kane, her fingers shaking only slightly as the adrenaline started to fade. Porter took the items and nodded to the medic, who was already lifting a hand to signal her over. The medic worked with quick, quiet movements, wrapping gauze around the cut on Claire's head and checking her for deeper injuries. Porter issued calm orders behind them, telling his team to secure the remains of the compound and pull any intelligence that had not been lost to the fire. Claire felt her breath steady as the noise of the rotors filled the space where fear had been living only minutes earlier. She had made it out, and the weight of what she carried no longer rested on her alone. The briefing tent felt heavy with the smell of dust and recycled air, as Claire Morgan placed the flash drives and sat phone on the table in front of Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale and Lieutenant Colonel James Porter. Screens glowed with lines of code while analysts worked in tense silence, decoding shipment logs and encrypted files taken from Victor Kane's pocket. Each new page revealed a clearer picture of TX-13 being routed toward a ceremony packed with senior officials, hidden behind the kind of clean paperwork that usually passed without a second glance. Claire watched Hale's jaw tighten as the evidence built, his posture growing heavier with every map that lit up on the display. Across the tent, Sergeant First Class Thomas Reyes stirred on a medical cot, the bandages at his side rising and falling with short breaths. When he woke, he asked for Claire and warned her that someone inside the command structure had been feeding Desert Viper their movements for weeks. He spoke slowly, explaining how the hidden tags in the traffic matched the pattern he had seen before their cover slipped. His voice thinned when he said the name he had traced the traffic back to, and the tent seemed to still around them when he whispered, "Captain Melissa Rain." An analyst approached with a faded photograph pulled from one of the encrypted folders, showing Rain years earlier standing beside Nikolai Voss. Hale stared at the image as if he could force it to change, then stepped back. As Claire opened the mission log she had taken from the compound, she matched timestamps, access records, and altered deployment orders with the precision she used in the field, drawing a line straight from Rain to the operation that had nearly killed them. Each connection landed like another heavy stone dropped onto the table. Porter looked at Claire and saw the moment she made her decision before she spoke it. She said she had to be the one to reach Rain, and there was no hesitation in her tone, only a steady certainty that came from knowing how far this betrayal had stretched. Hale held her gaze for a long moment, torn between the rules he lived by and the threat that had nearly come to life under his watch. In the end, he gave a small, quiet nod, the kind that carried more weight than a full order, and the tent seemed to breathe again as Claire stepped back to prepare for what waited ahead. The service corridor felt cold as Claire Morgan moved at the front of her small team, each step measured and quiet as they approached the secured room deep inside the federal facility. Their formation stayed tight, with Claire signaling each shift as they rounded corners and cleared intersections in controlled movements. The air carried a faint electrical buzz from overhead lights, and the tension grew sharper. With every foot they closed toward the armored case they knew held TX-13. Claire felt her pulse steady as she reminded herself that hesitation could cost far more than her own life. When they reached the final doorway, she eased it open and saw Captain Melissa Rain standing beside the case as if she had been waiting for them. Rain's posture was calm and almost serene, her hand hovering near the suitcase that blinked with a small red light on its latch. Claire stepped forward, while her team spread out to the edges of the room, their weapons trained on Rain with the focus of operators who understood the stakes. Rain lifted her chin slightly, as though she still believed the outcome belonged to her. The moment Rain's hand dropped toward the case, Claire lunged, knocking the table hard enough that it scraped across the tile. A gunshot cracked through the room, the sound sharp and final as Rain collapsed beside the overturned chair. Claire's breath hitched for a single second before she knelt beside the suitcase and pressed her fingers to the lock, watching the red light shift slowly into a dead black that signaled the threat had been neutralized. The weight of that small change settled heavy in her chest. Backup teams rushed in through the corridor, spreading out to secure the room and sweep for any secondary devices. Claire stepped back while they worked, knowing that none of the people gathering outside the building would ever hear how close they had come to a disaster. The silence that followed felt deeper than relief, carrying the heavy truth that some victories would always remain hidden from the world they protected. The early morning light stretched across the pavement outside the federal facility as Claire Morgan stepped into the cool air. Letting the weight of the night settle across her shoulders, the sky carried a pale softness that did not match the sharp memories still running through her mind. But she let the quiet settle around her anyway. The compound behind her buzzed with low voices and hurried steps as teams filed reports that would never mention her name. Claire stood still for a moment, breathing in the calm that came after chaos. Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale walked toward her with a slow, steady stride. His expression caught somewhere between reprimand and gratitude. He told her she had broken rules that were not meant to be bent. Yet she had saved lives that would never know how close they came to being lost. Claire listened without shifting her stance, accepting his words with the calm of someone who saw her work as duty rather than something meant for recognition. Her reply was quiet and simple, carried on a breath that held no pride and no regret. There were no photographers crowding the entrance and no speeches waiting for anyone who walked out of that building. Cars passed by on the street beyond the gate, with no idea that the world around them had steadied again because of a choice made in a hidden room. The facility workers moved on with their morning routines, checking badges and resetting checkpoints as if the night had been ordinary. Claire felt a strange comfort in that normalcy, as if the silence itself was proof she had done what needed to be done. She turned toward the waiting transport plane across the tarmac, its engines still quiet in the first light. The flag above the hangar snapped in the wind, sharp and steady, cutting through the soft morning air. Claire walked toward it with her steps slow and even, letting the sunrise wash over her bruised hands and tired eyes. She did not need applause or headlines, because the work had never been about being seen. As she reached the ramp of the transport, she paused for one last breath of the cool morning. True courage, she thought, often lived in moments no one would ever witness. It lived in the silence, carried by people who asked for nothing more than the chance to keep others safe. Then she stepped inside, ready for whatever waited beyond the next horizon.